Welcome everyone to ARTIVISM, the Power of Art for Social Transformation. This presentation is recorded and will be uploaded for educational purposes on our YouTube channel, ARTIVISM for Shared Humanity. Thank you all for being here. Today we have a ARTIVISM ambassador, Dr. Gillian Howell. Dr. Gillian Howell is a research fellow at the University of Melbourne, where she leads a portfolio of research investigating the contributions of community music to post-war transitions and recovery, including peace building, community dialogue, and music restoration. Her applied research and creative practice have taken her around Australia and the world, including to Bosnia, Herzegovina, Sri Lanka, Timor-Leste, Kosovo, and North Macedonia, and she has delivered research consultancies for Save the Children Middle East, Musicians Without Borders, and Tura New Music. Closer to home, Dr. Howell's long-term research and songwriting collaboration with the First Natives language educators in remote Northwest Australia has produced 2 albums and a community songbook in 3 endangered Aboriginal languages. Oh my goodness, we need to learn more about this as well, Gillian. We have to have you back so you can tell us all about your work and your initiatives. Gillian, would you like to introduce Dr. Brydie-Leigh Bartleet?
Yes, with pleasure, and thank you so much for that lovely introduction. So Brydie and I have known each other for quite a long time, first through the International Society for Music Education's Community Music Commission. We met there when I was at my first Community Music Commission meeting, and then I later wanted to start my PhD, and I chose Brydie and her colleague, Dr. Howell Skippers, to be my supervisors at Griffith University. So I worked with Brydie to do my PhD, which was looking at music interventions and the restoring and restarting of music activities in post-war environments, and how they interact with international aid, and some of the complications and tensions that can arise when you bring the very intuitive and so quite intimate worlds of art and art making into dialogue with the very bureaucratic and often very technocratic world of international development. And since then, I've been working more in the area of peace building. So a lot of my work is concerned with how communities restore relationships and social fabric following division during a war. And really that whole interest began when I was quite a young musician, recently finished my music studies, and I was invited to join a team of musicians working in Bosnia just after the war had ended there, to work in schools, refugee camps, and community settings, to run music workshops and to try and create opportunities for young people to be getting together, sharing music. And I think that's that's probably gone now. Good. Restoring their relationships, working together, cooperating, and starting to engage in this collective imagining of what an alternative future might be for them and their community. So it's really wonderful to hear about that work in the Cyprus kindergarten that you were talking about before we started the recording. You young people have a lot to say about a divided world, and they have a lot of solutions to offer, but they also remind us that, in fact, we need to keep imagining peace. We need to keep the possibility of peace very strong and alive. And I think music has a very profound contribution to make to that work. So this brings me to Brydie's work, because Brydie's research, particularly at the moment, is asking a really hard but important question, which is, how do we move from these micro spaces, these community-based spaces, to bring about social change, but then to see that change being transferred at the macro level? So perhaps it's about scaling up, perhaps it's also about strategies that are engaged within the project itself and the way that the project is approached. This is her area. It's the subject of her current Australian Research Council Future Fellowship, which is an incredibly prestigious research fellowship offered here to a very small number of researchers each year. And Brydie's put together a team of brilliant PhD researchers at Griffith and set up the Creative Change Project, and essentially a hub of activity and programs that include practice-based research, as well as more traditional text-based and case study research. So So I'm really excited to hear Brydie, who is a good friend and a wonderful colleague and mentor, talk about her work and share it with you today. It's incredibly important work that she's doing. So we have a more detailed introduction, but that's been printed on the webpage. So I'd like to now hand over directly to Brydie. Thank you.
Thanks so much, Gillian, and a very good evening, good morning, good afternoon to you, wherever you are in the world. And Gillian, thank you for those kind words. When I had a chance to think about an ARTIVISM ambassador who I thought would be wonderful in this context and would have so much to offer this network, I didn't hesitate when Gillian's name popped into my mind as somebody whose work I think has such beautiful resonances with this particular network. So Gillian, thank you for your kind words and for warming up the space so beautifully. Also, a huge thanks to Carolina and to Arji for the invitation to be here. I'm really honoured to have the opportunity to come and meet with you and to share some of the work that I've been doing. And I recall very fondly meeting you at an event that you organised in New York last year when I was there on my Fulbright, and the wonderful Alina Bloomgarden told me about it and said I should be there, and I'm so glad I was. And it's been lovely to keep up those connections since we met in New York last year, and wonderful to have the chance to speak today. I'd like to begin with an Australian custom, and this is a custom of our First Nations peoples, and that is to acknowledge the country where we are gathering on. It's a little tricky in an online environment because we're all in different places, but I am sitting on the traditional lands of the Jagera and Turrbal peoples. And so it's customary for us to begin an important gathering or a conversation or a meeting by acknowledging the elders, past, present, and emerging, and extending that respect to our First Nations collaborators, friends, colleagues, family, kin, who we spend our time with. And I wanted to begin by acknowledging that. And of course, thinking back to my time in New York, I also thought a lot about the First Nations peoples there and the history as well, and the important country where that big metropolis sits on. So I wanted to begin with that acknowledgement. I'm going to now start sharing my slides, and hopefully these will all be visible to you, where you can see some of the faces and the images of the research that I'm going to be sharing with you this morning and this evening. So what I'm wanting to do in this talk is open up a conversation about the role that community music can play in addressing entrenched social inequity. And the title of my talk, which you can see on screen now, asks whether community music can help create more equitable societies. The short answer, I think, is yes. Yes, I think it can play an important role, but I think it's important to also acknowledge that music is not a magic bullet that works in isolation miraculously to fix social inequity. But I think it can be a highly effective approach that can be used with other approaches to bring about greater equity and justice in our societies. So in my talk, I'm actually going to pose a slightly more vexing question, particularly to a group who are interested in ARTIVISM, and that is, how does music do this? As researchers and practitioners, managers, producers, educators, funders, whoever we may be in this room, how can we become better at conceptualizing and critically framing how the positive outcomes from music making can lead to the kinds of macro systemic changes needed for social equity to occur? That question that Gillian mentioned in her introduction of how those micro and macro factors might work together in a music context to help bring about greater social equity. That's the question I want to talk a little bit about today. So to work through these questions in my talk, what I'm going to do is draw on insights from my Australian Research Council Future Fellowship, which Gillian mentioned a moment ago, called the Creative Change Project, which is seeking to examine the role that community music can play in addressing entrenched social inequity in Australia. We're about halfway through this project, so what I'm sharing with you is fresh, hot off the press and still in development. but it's always a great chance to talk at this moment in a project. This research is basically aiming to explore the creative change that music can bring to place-based initiatives that are seeking to tackle disadvantage in communities. And while our research is based in Australia, as I discovered when I was in the US for my Fulbright last year, there are many synergies with the US and indeed with the rest of the world. So I know most of our viewers this morning or this evening are in the US, and I'd be really interested to hear your reflections on how what I'm sharing from the Australian context actually resonates or maybe doesn't in the US context. So with the topic as diverse as this and as complex as this, I believe it can't be answered by one person alone. Typically, these future fellowships are one lone researcher who's the star researcher who does all the work. And I think that that doesn't really fit for a project like this. So I'm really delighted to be working with a dream team who come to this project with incredible creativity and diverse lived experiences of the topic, and you can see the team on screen right now. We also have an international advisory group and cultural and community mentors who are helping to guide and shape this research. So that they're here in spirit, I'm just going to play a brief introductory video that helps to sort of contextualize the project that I'm talking about a little bit and bring it to life. And the sounds, including the bird calls, and the words and the images have come from different parts of our project and places that we've been traveling, and they've been generated to reflect our individual as well as our collective engagement with the project. So I'm just going to play you a little introductory video now so you can get a sense of what we're working on. Hopefully that gave you a little of a taste and sense and sensory introduction to the project and the team who are working on this with me. Now that you know a little bit more about our project, I think it might be worth pausing for a moment to touch on some of the key terms that you've heard me say and that you've seen on screen a moment ago, as I'm really mindful that definitions of these can really vary widely across the world. As I've mentioned, the focus of our work is on community music, and Gillian and I will know from many years of working in this field, understandings of what that is are very different in, say, the US to Australia, the UK, and in our Asia Pacific region, where we're doing a lot of work to see how we can shape and define it in different ways. So our Creative Change project team define a community as a group of people who share a connection that binds them together. That connection may form around a shared geographical place, a space, an interest, a value, identity, need, or circumstance. A healthy community has agency, with members making an active choice to pursue this connection with others. Other times, of course, a community may be involuntary, forced together by external factors, circumstances, and policies. And as such, communities exist in many different and diverse forms, compositions, layers, and intersections. And communities exist across different timescales and intensities with varying degrees of regularity and continuity. I think it's always worth pausing to say, how do we understand community? Because so often people use the term and expect that everybody understands it in the same way that they do. So we really see it as something very dynamic and fluid. And this conceptualization of community, of course, then leads to considerations of music making. For our creative change team, community music can be broadly defined for us as participatory music making by, for, and with a community. At its heart, community music involves the creation of inclusive, locally embedded, community-led approaches for engagement with collective music making. Rather than being characterized by a particular style or a genre or a medium or an aesthetic, community music is distinctively reflective of its cultural context and shaped by its participants and local setting. Given its focus on community agency, musical practices within this field customarily work to uphold values of inclusivity, access, equity, justice, and self-determination, even if they don't explicitly set out to do so. And many of these values, I think, will resonate very strongly with the topics and themes and conversations that you would have heard about in this ARTIVISM series so far. I think they also resonate quite strongly with concepts of teaching artistry, which is possibly a term that you might be more familiar with and used a lot in the US. Then we come to the terms social inequity and social equity. I'd love to hear how you think about these in your lives and worlds and in the research and practice you might be doing. I see this concept of social inequity is also a foundational concept in this ARTIVISM series. So hopefully what I have to say here resonates really strongly with what you've heard so far. For us and our team, when we're describing social inequity, we say that it can be understood as avoidable, unjust, and therefore inexcusable disparities in the resources, opportunities, rewards, and rights a person has based on their position within society. And the foundations of social inequity are structural and relate to social systems of power that cause certain groups to thrive at the expense of others. Social inequity is a growing issue facing Australian communities, and having been in the US recently, I can suspect that it's a very similar case there as well, with key groups continuing to experience disparities across a range of life outcomes, including education, health, housing, work and employment, community and interpersonal relationships, which of course, as we know, has been exacerbated by the global pandemic, as well as conflict and climate disasters. An individual's social location, so for example, their gender, their sexuality, their age, their ethnicity, intersect with social systems of power, such as racism, classism, poverty, sexism, patriarchy, homophobia, to further exacerbate inequity. In contrast, our team understands social equity to mean that every person, regardless of their cultural, social, economic, demographic, or geographic positions, has a fair and just opportunity to reach their fullest potential and live a fulfilled life. As our team says, it's about a person being able to live the life they want to live and be accepted. So to achieve such social outcomes requires addressing the foundational systemic causes of inequities, such as poverty and discrimination and their consequences. as Gillian said at the introduction, those macro forces that we know have an impact on an individual's life. And we're interested to see how all of this comes together and whether community music can play a role in addressing social equity and inequity. And to show how these two concepts come together in Australia, I thought I might share a couple of more concrete examples from a national map that we're building to understand what this practice actually looks and sounds like around the country. We're still in the process of working on this map, but we already have about close to 100 different examples of music projects, which are providing really interesting and rich insights into this question of how community music can help create more equitable societies. And I'm going to share a few of them with you now, because I think this helps to bring these sort of more conceptual questions I'm framing up to life. The first I wanted to share is called Rudely Interrupted. So Rudely Interrupted, and you can look up these amazing programs after the talk, is one of Australia's more unique independent rock acts, touring and releasing their brand of pitch perfect, as they call it, indie rock love pop anthems internationally, and they've been going since 2006. And band members write together, they perform and produce music and tour the world. And they've developed a really powerful sense of connection to the world through music and friendships within the band environment. Rudely Interrupted also provides band members with a connection to community, including local and international music communities and the disability community as well. And Rudely Interrupted demonstrate to the world what is possible when given the right support and a little talent to grow as people and as musicians, to challenge any personal perceptions held by folks of what disability means and what can be achieved. They're really worth looking up, so check them out. Another one I wanted to share is called Everybody Now, and Everybody Now are quite local to us. They're not too far away from us here in Queensland, and they've run an incredible program called Roller Coaster. And Roller Coaster explores story, song, and skating in celebration of diverse voices and lived experiences of life on wheels. And Everybody Now works to create a planet, they say, where more people feel connected, empowered, and valued in their communities to be who they want to be and to live the lives they want to be and accepted through active participation in the arts. And through the creation of inclusive, creative experiences where people are able to share their own personal stories and see those stories reflected back through music and story. This roller coaster has developed really interesting artistic content that they describe as big, as edgy and tough, but also full of those wonderful intrinsic values of music and the arts, of joy and connection. And I'm just going to play you a very, very short little promo video so you can get a sense of the energy that comes from this project. As you can see, high energy, but amazing celebration of life and joy. The next one I wanted to share with you is another one that's quite local to us, and it's called the Stairwell Project, something completely different. The mission of the Stairwell Project is to work with hospital staff and patients and their families to connect with professional musicians who bring a calming musical presence into the hospital wards, the foyers, and the public spaces as musicians in hospitals. And their work revolves around reimagining clinical spaces and reimagining clinical practice for staff, patients, family, and friends. And Stairwell Project musicians have talked about the life-changing impact of engagement with the patients and the staff really testify to the calm, peace and joy that this project brings. Their musicians bring a positive and uplifting presence to the hospitals where they volunteer. So this is a very community-focused project, and promote a new way of seeing how medical care can be positively linked to the arts. And beautifully, a young cancer patient now performs with the group, and there are amazing stories of them planting musicians in the stairwells of hospitals. And as you can imagine, the surgeons run up and down between highly stressful scenarios, and when they encounter a drummer in the stairwell, all of a sudden their perception of what's happening is changing. And so this is a really interesting play around reimagining spaces through music. And then the last example to bring some of these ideas to life comes from the Northern Territory, and it's the Wunundjeri Music Centre, who we've worked with for many, many years, well over a decade. The Wunundjeri Music Centre is a hub for music in the Barkly region, which is a very, very remote part of Central Australia. If you can imagine a map of Australia, it's right in the heart, so it's very, very remote. And they provide access and opportunities for musicians to record and rehearse and perform. And music is playing a bigger and bigger role than ever in the Barkly region, celebrating pride in language and culture, preserving at-risk languages, and offering a chance for disengaged community members to come and feel a real sense of belonging and commit to be part of something that is really productive and exciting. And the annual Desert Harmony Festival acts as a showcase for Barkly music acts and give bands and artists an opportunity to perform on the big stage to many passionate local audiences. And for many years, we've travelled up to the Desert Harmony Festival, which really provides a wonderful showcase for these Wunundjeri musicians. A local crew of employees and volunteers gain experience and learning opportunities in all aspects of live and studio audio production, as well as event management and technical maintenance. And through the Wunundjeri Music Centre, musicians become role models and engage with services, learn skills around time management, commitment, teamwork. And we've seen in the research that we've done over many years with them, real improvements in mental health and also those well-being outcomes of feeling hope and ambition. And the music created through Wunundjeri programs really celebrate and create pride in language and culture, and work to unite us as a nation through opportunities to learn and enjoy the immense musical talent and unique perspective of expression from the remote songwriters of this region. And I just wanted to share a video, and this is a song featuring Brian Morton in the kinship system, my uncle, who's been a wonderful mentor for many years and a proud advocate of keeping culture strong through this program. And I think it's an excellent example of some of the more conceptual issues we've been talking about. So I'm going to play you the video of this, Keep My Culture Strong.
Kurare, Madaga, Manembaklango, Rinyani, Niningila, Pradangolo, Imi, Majanamo, Mutinani. Sitting by the firelight, the moon is shining bright,
listening to all the people telling the dreamtime story. I'm thinking very deeply about that dreaming, how it is the backbone to this land.
Keep my culture strong.
Keep my culture strong.
Culture is amazing, it's identity and meaning.
It's the way to survive.
Can't forget ancestors, we gotta keep it all alive.
Pass it on to our children. Our children, keep our children strong. Keep my culture strong. Keep my culture
Madaga, Manibaka,
Madaga,
Citizen Noka, Hilgatikina,
Madaga,
คิดนู่นนะก็ฮิลกัดแค่ไหน
Uyanga Pakama, Naina Madaga,
นู่นนะก็ฮิลกัดแค่ไหน
Kocha,
Manibaka, Green, living in the land. I'm standing in my country. Feel the power in the ground.
It's what all people said. All people said.
When my time is done, I'm no longer walk the same. My spirit will return to the place I love.
To the place I love.
Keep my culture strong.
Keep my culture strong.
Keep my culture strong. Carry on. Keep my culture strong. Keep my culture strong. Keep my culture strong. Carry on.
Uyanga, Barkamara, Uyanga, Barkamara,
Culture, keep it strong. Keep our culture, keep it strong. Keep our culture, keep it strong. Keep our culture, keep it strong.
Barkamara, Uyanga,
Keep my culture, keep it strong.
Barkamara.
Keep our culture, keep it strong.
Barkamara.
As you can see from that video, that was a huge collective community effort, and it's always lovely to see all those familiar faces of so many different community members there. And I know that this was really special to Brian to also have all of the youngsters involved and also the incorporation of language. So Brian will be very chuffed to know that I played that video in this talk today. I'll be texting him saying, hey, uncle, guess what? Your video was played across the world and in the US, and he'll be really chuffed because he's constantly saying to me, we need to share that video. That's a really important message we need to get out. So I hope you enjoyed it. So those were just a few examples, as I said, from 100 that we're gathering at the moment, to ask the question of how community music can come together to start to work towards a range of social justice and social equity outcomes. And hopefully those examples are starting to spark your mind of the different range of equity concerns we might think about music addressing, from some of those relating to health equity to those relating to cultural justice. And hopefully it's starting to get you thinking about those broader questions of how music is working. We're also actually doing a number of in-depth case studies, and our 3 PhDs and our research fellow are working on some in-depth case studies I thought I might briefly share as well, to help give you even more ideas of the ways in which music is working to try and create more equitable societies. And each of our PhDs and research fellow, as I said, are partnering with one particular arts organisation who has had a really long engagement in a community working around social justice and social equity concerns. And one of the examples is also a really interesting social sector organisation. So Flora Wong, one of our PhD candidates, for example, has been spending time in regional towns in Queensland in partnership with Queensland Music Trails. And her case study is exploring how cultural tourism interacts with the community music making ecology in regional towns of Australia. And specifically, she's looking at how this can promote access to cultural experiences in really geographically isolated locations, and also how it can showcase the strengths-based cultural identity of these places and enhance the economic development of these towns through an ethical type of tourism that's focused on creating social good, rather than the more inequitable situation which we know can commonly occur when tourism happens in remote towns. Our other PhD candidate, Joel Spence, has been spending time in a remote community in Western Australia, and in partnership with Big Art's Songs for Freedom program, his case study is examining how the process of collective songwriting can heal a community deeply affected by generations of injustice due to the ongoing impacts of colonial policies, particularly in places like this with a high First Nations population, as well as an unjust justice system and highly divisive mining practices, which have all happened in this location. And specifically, he's looking at ways in which songwriting can provide a pathway for individual and collective well-being, as well as advocacy and activism, ARTIVISM, publicly sharing and shaping community stories over a decade to try and bring about reforms to this unjust juvenile justice system, which has a tendency to incarcerate at extremely high rates First Nations young people, and try to bring about changes to those policies. Our third PhD candidate, Pearlie Black, who's an amazing singer, has been spending time in the large metropolitan city of Melbourne in Victoria, where Gillian lives, in partnership with Play It Forward and their Peace Choir and La Trobe Choir. Her case study is exploring how shared group singing experiences can promote social connection, social trust, and social bonding. In addition to this, she's also co-leading a vocal improvisation group on her own to explore these issues. She is particularly interested in how the process of deep listening, whilst also singing at the same time, can create dialogic spaces that promote a deeper, more empathic understanding of social issues and promote social equity. And then the last case study, which is being led by our research fellow, Emma Hurd, has led her to spend more time in her own backyard in West End, which is a short walk away from our conservatorium where the project is based. So we're interested in not only working in communities far away, but also communities in our own backyard. And in partnership with the major social services provider called Micah Projects, her case study is exploring the relationship between community music making and social equity from a place-based perspective. In a location known for very high levels of social sector provision and growing inequities caused by gentrification and urban development. And specifically, this case study aims to capture a breadth of community music practice happening across the whole area and consider those upstream implications of this practice to inform both arts and social sector development. So with all these case studies and projects that I've been mentioning and the examples that I've shared earlier with you, what all of these have in common is that they're deeply grounded in a sense of place. And place-based approaches to addressing inequity, of course, were very much born out of the recognition that socioeconomic disadvantage clusters around geographical locations, and that collaborative and cross-disciplinary approaches are needed to allow social support systems to really work together to achieve positive change in these communities where there's clusters of disadvantage. And this draws on decades of research that demonstrates that where a person is born, where they live, where they work, and where they grow old has profound implications for their well-being. So place-based approaches recognise that communities have unique strengths, but also unique needs and challenges, which means that a one-size-fits-all approach is unlikely to be effective in addressing disadvantage. And this is where I think our case studies and the mapping process examples, which I've just shared, are showing that the arts can make a very significant contribution And we've recently published a systematic literature review that also looks at this topic, not only in practice, but in studies that have looked at the outcomes of what these various projects are doing. And I'm just going to share it with you on screen right now. You can look it up and read it if it's of interest to you. And in line with the ethics of our project, making sure that everything we do is accessible to everyone. It's free and open access to all. So you can click on the link and I can share the slides afterwards and you can access that. So drawing on insights from 38 outcome studies in this article, Emma, Jeff and I outline the important potential role that place-based arts initiatives can play in building social equity. And you've also seen some examples of that in what I've shared so far. Yet, despite this potential, we also suggest that the arts tend to remain largely absent in place-based policy, planning and practice in Australia. And I wonder if the same is in the US. We conclude, Arjie's, yes, saying that that's certainly the case. We conclude that understanding and rigorously reporting the outcomes of place-based arts initiatives is really important to both strengthening best practice and innovation, but also to build a more compelling evidence base that can help support widespread integration of the arts and all of these sorts of music programs you've seen so far into place-based policy, planning and practice, because we know that when we're talking about addressing social inequity and making communities more socially equitable, it needs to be done in a place-based approach that is specific to its cultural context. So now that I've set the scene with all of those examples of other projects that are all happening at the moment, as well as sharing definitions of key terms, we've been on a whirlwind trip so far. I wanted to return back to the question that I posed at the beginning and draw on some insights from some of the other projects that I've been involved with over many years and revisit that question I posed at the start. How can we become better at conceptualizing and critically framing how the positive outcomes from music making can lead to the kinds of macro systemic changes needed for real social equity to occur? The literature review that I just shared with you on screen a moment ago, as well as the mapping process, confirms what I've observed over the past 20 years of working with many, many arts organisations who are artivists and have bold social justice intentions, but have very little understanding about the processes that can actually lead to those macro sorts of changes. I've found in all of these examples, some of them on screen, that very often community music initiatives tend to target these macro structural domains in their rhetoric and their aspirations. So, for example, this music program is going to combat gender violence, or it's going to bring about cultural reconciliation. And in a divided country like we are in Australia right now, following a big referendum, it's going to fix all of that and bring us all together. But in reality, these programs tend to more frequently work on the individual, micro, as well as meso community level changes, with very little understanding of how those changes might flow upstream to more macro structural goals, or how different dimensions of change might all interconnect, almost like a little archipelago, to reach those goals. So this is not to say that those programs aren't having a positive social impact. All of the examples I've just shown you, you can see the impact and the benefit coming off the screen and in the faces and in the interactions. Those things are really clear. But I think we need to become much sharper in how we actually conceptualize and identify and evaluate and communicate and research how these positive outcomes can lead to those sorts of big macro systemic changes needed for social justice and social equity to occur. For many projects seeking to bring about social justice goals, questions still tend to remain around how things might flow upstream, as I said. And in my field of community music, there has also been a tendency when it comes to research to make these really large claims, but then try to answer them with really tiny, small scale projects that have quite flimsy and vague conceptualizations of how these sort of more systemic issues operate. And I guess that's one of the really rare and wonderful opportunities of having a big project like this, which we're doing, where we can look at 100 projects through a mapping process and go in deep with our case studies to really start to ask that how question of how music is working. So all of these questions and all of these challenges prompted me to try and develop a framework for my own research and practice that could help sharpen how I understand and articulate the social impact and the social justice goals of community music in the very wide-ranging context where I work. And I've recently published this. And details are on screen right now. And I also am so pleased Gillian's on the call right now, because some of the early work where I was trying to conceptualize this, Gillian was a great collaborator working with me, also somebody asking those similar questions, and really helped play a great role in shaping how I started to think about it. So on screen right now is this framework. Now it looks very linear and boxy and not particularly creative, but what it was an attempt to try and visualize how we might start to talk about and story and think all of these dimensions of how music is actually operating in these contexts. So I wanted to visually make it quite simple so that we could focus more on how we story and ask questions. So hopefully you might look at it and be able to start to ask yourself questions around some of the work that you're doing. But given the contextually driven nature of community music, which I mentioned in my key definitions at the beginning, I didn't want to sort of come up with a singular theory, a universal theory about the role that community music can play in bringing about social equity. Gillian and I had conversations like, could we come up with a macro theory of change, a huge, big Uber theory of change that might answer these questions, and realize that it becomes really challenging to do that because it's also contextually specific. And as I've come to understand, work that seeks to make a social impact or address social equity really involves very dynamic, integrated and relational processes where shifts in social behaviours and institutions are triggered by multiple events across different timescales and different domains. So it becomes very hard to make it a very simple linear kind of illustration. So with all of these nuances in mind, the framework on screen right now tries to take a multidimensional view of the kinds of social outcomes that can be fostered by community music, and prompts us to consider how the process of achieving these has a social impact or leads to social equity. Research in social impact and indeed social equity uses this sort of multidimensional lens to consider outcomes for individuals, relationships, communities, and society. So too, this framework does the same, but thinking about it for music. And it builds on all sorts of other different frameworks, from public health, from arts evaluation, from systems change, from First Nations well-being, which we've used in previous studies. And each of the layers are designed to be read horizontally across a continuum, with points of connection between the layers being possible at any given stage. So in terms of the social impact across continua, I think to advance our understanding of the complex processes that are underlying community music and social equity, this framework allows us to kind of theorize how community music moves in and across continua, making explicit the differing dimensions, stages, and degrees of change that need to happen. And you can see those represented on screen. So when it comes to thinking about dimensions of change, in this way, it can allow for greater precision in how community music initiatives are conceptualized and investigated, from the individual, those personal changes, to the micro, which is around changing relationships, to the meso, which is around changing communities, to the macro, which is around changing structures. And the arrows in the framework show that these domains are porous and oftentimes entangled, highlighting music's potential to have an impact in multiple domains at the same time. And these arrows can also be extended in multiple directions between all of the different dimensions, challenging us to consider the many potential research questions that we could explore around how these interactions might occur. I think, as I mentioned, currently, much of the research and evaluation and rhetoric in the community music field either narrowly focuses on isolated outcomes or focuses so wide that it makes these really unsubstantiated claims about community music being a cure-all for everything or for completely solving a wicked social problem. And this allows us to think a little bit more sharply about this. When it comes to stages of impact, which is the next layer, beneath the outcomes here, these aren't conceived as sort of linear lines, but rather, as I said, a continuum. And this allows for the delineation between immediate effects, intermediate changes, and the anticipation and realization of longer-term social impact or social justice. And the stages of change sit here on a continuum that can kind of slide up and down in any given program. Immediate changes might be, say, developing awareness of an issue or knowledge about that issue, whereas longer-term impact might be actually resolving this issue, producing census or a change in policy. And all of these things are vitally key outcomes in any ARTIVISM project. This framework also encourages us to look at the ways in which community music can create the preconditions for change, or indeed promote the kinds of pro-social behaviour that might then play a more preventative role. And understanding, I think, the distinctions and relationships between these stages can allow us to bring greater precision to articulating and exploring the processes and outcomes of this work. And certainly this is the case in our ARTIVISM work. In terms of the degrees of impact, this once again is a continuum, and it's not meant to be looked at in a linear line. But these degrees of impact can occur within all 4 dimensions of social outcomes, from the individual to the micro to the meso and the macro. And it's worth noting that these can be positive or negative depending on whose perspective you're examining them from. And likewise, this continuum also accounts for stasis, which is rarely studied in our field of community music. It's all about change. Stasis can sometimes be indicating, say, a reaction or resistance to change, which might actually be the result of self-determination. And I think that's another interesting position to ponder in terms of ARTIVISM. And the conceptualization also allows for small changes that commonly occur in music. And these are the types of changes, adjustments, responses, and progressions that I think I'm probably most interested in at the moment. I'm really interested in these small changes and how they become nested into these bigger macro changes. And I'm really drawn to the work of Clisla Harrison, who's an ethnomusicologist who's done a lot of work around music and poverty, and also in First Nations contexts. And she, when writing about First Nations music and addiction recovery, she talks about these small moments of change that aren't characterized by these big grand sweeps of transformation, but these small turns of thought and feeling, and how those can actually become the most significant in terms of affecting much more macro types of change. So that's just some thinking on a conceptual level, grounded in all of the examples I've just shared, where we're trying to become a bit more precise when it comes to the how things are happening, and recognizing that this is a multi-dimensional project. It's not just a linear kind of project. And this is also being backed by a major systematic review that our research fellow Emma Hurd and I have just recently completed. So it's not just based on our own practice and examples of 20 years of research in the field, but also in a major systematic review, a critical interpretive synthesis review to be precise, that we completed to set up our creative change project. And we did a scan and yielded, as you can imagine, in this broad topic, over 5,000 articles, which we then narrowed down using the systematic review approach to 73 articles, where we looked really closely at what they were telling us in terms of how music and community music in particular might be able to contribute towards creating more equitable communities. And outcomes, we've represented that in the diagram on screen right now, supported the immediate well-being of individuals experiencing marginalisation and or disadvantage. There were also outcomes that built capacity in individuals to potentially enact change relating to social equity. And then lastly, outcomes that work to directly address social structural foundations of inequity, for example, forms of discrimination. Interestingly, and this is the last point I'm going to make before concluding, most of the individual studies reported positive outcomes for individual participants experiencing disadvantage. And these were wonderful, as I said, well-being, social connection, identity formation, and affirmation, confidence, and empowerment. You can see those on screen. And under this category, outcomes really were around empowering individual participants with the skills and the knowledge and the understandings to make positive changes, with the potential for shifting social inequity within their communities. Outcomes reported within our sample also suggest that community music programs have the potential to affect change by challenging harmful social norms, by acting as advocacy tools, ARTIVISM tools, and promoting socially just interactions and new visions of equitable societies. Many of the articles identified in our review point to immediate positive outcomes for individuals who are marginalised by society. And however, without diminishing those immediate impact participation outcomes, we found that without a structural focus on inequity, this work very much tended to focus on mitigating the consequences of inequity rather than enacting transformative change. And so we also found that community music programs that support efforts for broader social change, drawing on the power of music to address all of those sorts of biases and things that I mentioned before. There are some of them, but they're in the minority. We found huge clusters of articles and outcomes that very much focused on that first dimension, like I said, the individual and making the lives of those experiencing inequity much better. But the further we flowed upstream towards actually changing macro structures that keep things like systemic racism in place, the less outcome studies we found. People don't tend to be going up into that macro stream and researching. There was a lot less to find there. And so what we're really suggesting is that if we need to, if we want to talk about social justice and by extension ARTIVISM, we really need to be thinking about removing those systemic barriers and addressing the causes of social inequity. And we need to have a much sharper understanding of music's capacity to flow upstream to this level. And we need more research. We've seen that there are major gaps in research studies that look at outcomes at that level. So to return to the question I opened with, through our project's conceptualization and framework and all the systematic reviews that we're doing and the case studies that we're doing, we're really hoping to become much sharper at conceptualizing and critically framing how the positive outcomes from music making can actually lead to those more macro systemic changes. I really look forward to any thoughts that you might have on this, as well as answering any questions we might have. And I've put my contact details on screen now. We're very active on the socials. We like sharing stories of our research as we go along. So So I encourage you to follow us on Instagram and Facebook and Twitter, and you might like to take a look at our website where you'll be able to read a lot more about the study. So as I said, we're halfway through. Thanks for letting me share what we've done so far, some of the big curly questions we're asking. I hope they relate to you, and I hope that you've also walked away with a few ideas of thinking about this big question around music and social equity within your own work as well. So on that note, I'm going to hand back to Gillian.
Thank you so much, Bridie. That was inspiring and provocative. Asked some hard questions that, by the sounds of it, lots of people haven't answered and also perhaps aren't asking. So really important work that's happening with the Creative Change team in Brisbane. Argie and Carolina, I noticed that we're right on time. So at this point, I'm imagining I should be wrapping up. Is that what, that's where we need to go? So it means that if you have burning questions for Professor Bartleet, then please do email them to her. I'm sure she and her team will be very pleased to receive them and to respond further. For my part, though, I'd like to thank Bridie for her presentation and for being today's Artivist. Next Monday on October 30th, Mary Ellen Kernaghan and Catherine Schuler will present about Mark and Charlie, Unlikely Heroes with a Common Legacy, which is a beautiful title and sounds very intriguing. And for more information about this and all the series past and upcoming events, then please go to the website, which Argie shared a little earlier in the comments, but also follow on Facebook for people who are watching the video later, Instagram, and at ARTIVISM for Shared Humanity, or simply Google ARTIVISM and Adelphi. And the YouTube channel is ARTIVISM for Shared Humanity. And if you'd like to get involved in this ongoing initiative, then please contact the ARTIVISM team. And I'll hand back now to Argie and Carolina to close the session. Thanks.
Thank you for this beautiful presentation. There are many comments in the chat. I can share the transcript with you if you'd like when we close up. Any questions or comments? Before we get to any, if there are any, I just want to talk about the power of music in children's voices. You know, when you hear the children's little voices along with, you know, the music and the adults singing, for me, it gives me goosebumps. It just brings it all together, much like the video we talked about with the children, you know, from one of the posters at ARTIVISM and their little video. I want to know, Brydie, why music for you?
Thanks, Argie, and great comment around the children and the intergenerational aspects of music making. And as I think you saw in the Keep My Culture Strong video, what was so powerful was the little kids internalizing that message of keeping their culture strong, but also then being exposed to language and watching the role modeling happening of their elders. And in the many years of research that we've done in that community, we've really looked at the strong intergenerational teaching aspects of it. But for me, I mean, I've always had a life in music. I can't imagine a time when music wasn't present. I trained at the Conservatorium as a trumpet player and went into conducting, and then went into community music making, and then became very interested in research in community context, but also coming from the conducting world, very interested in issues of gender equity, which is what my doctorate was on. And that really got me interested also in the intersections of social justice and music making. And I grew up in South Africa and in apartheid South Africa, and looked at how music was used as such a powerful tool to bring down that horrific institution and a way to reimagine a reconciled and healed future. So it's been something that's been a passion of mine for as long as I can remember. And as we close, Argie, I just wanted to thank everyone for the comments. I was scrolling through and appreciating everyone's care and thoughts in the many comments that they put in the chat. There's some really wonderful reflections there that really resonate strongly. So thanks to everyone for that.
We will also like to extend our thank you to Dr. Howell for being our marvelous ARTIVISM ambassador today. We also look forward to your full ARTIVISM presentation and to Dr. Bartlett for your part 2 once you finish the project. Also here in ARTIVISM, or as the project continues, because always in these frameworks, there's not an ending per se, you know, it's always evolving, it's always growing, but definitely please keep us informed of all the discoveries and how the research evolves on both of your projects. Thank you. In ARTIVISM here, we also like to ask the presenters for a key takeaway in regards to what you discussed, what you presented today, right? And how the audience can take that into an action item.
I think my key takeaway was to consistently ask the how question. I think we're so good at saying music does this, it does these great things. And as musicians, we see them happening. We can very easily describe those outcomes, but we don't always ask ourselves that really critical and reflective question of how change happens in our field. And so my takeaway would be to always keep asking that how continually and use that reflective question in your own practice as well.
I think my
yes, go ahead.
My key takeaway is about that interaction between music and the wider context. You know, if we're looking to create change, then the context is going to be both an enabler and an inhibitor. There'll be challenges that have nothing to do with music and that music may be able to affect, but you're going to need to be potentially a little bit subversive about how you dismantle that particular structure or apparatus that is causing a block. So I think even though our interest is music and the making of music and the experience of making music is so central, we can't ever in this work, we can't ever really focus only on that without paying that close attention to what's happening in the wider context. So there's a lot of contradictions in this work, or at least a lot of counterintuitive aspects. So, you know, this focus on the wider context and paying attention to those micro level things, but then also hoping for macro level changes, even within the one place. It's really complex work, but we have to keep that complexity in view at all times.
That's correct. And that's also when, as you mentioned earlier in the presentation, policy and that macro organism coming, meaning like the government, coming into play and taking the responsibility and the action that is needed for actually putting into practice the micro that is happening in the communities. Because sometimes, even as much as we focus in the micro, there has to be a policy change that will, as you mentioned, kind of like tear down that block. That way, the next level could be reached, because if not, it's kind of like just a repetition and repetition and repetition and not getting out of that cycle because the policy is still in place, right? But that perhaps we can continue in another conversation here in ARTIVISM. One time maybe we can have like a roundtable discussion about cultural policy around the world and how it affects these centralization of resources and what that does to the populations affected by it, correct? I would like to thank our audience. Thank you for always being an artivist. Thank you to Professor Argelarakis and the ARTIVISM team, Dr. Lake, our sponsors at Delta University, Sing for Hope, and Gottesman Libraries at Teachers College, Columbia University. We hope to see you all next time. Enjoy the rest of the day, evening, or night, depending on where you are.
Thank you so much. Thank you.
Thank you. Bye-bye.
Bye-bye.
Thanks again. Bye.
Bye-bye. And Gillian, we'll see you soon.
That'd be great. Thanks a lot for the invitation.
Bye-bye.
See you soon, Brydie.